Do you have some sourdough starter and it's looking bubbly and airy and on the rise and ready to bake with? Well, then let's get started. You're gonna want a kitchen scale that measures grams. You're gonna want some amount of bread flour from your local grocery store. You're gonna want some salt, some water, and in the perfect world, you might purchase yourself a little bit of rice flour because rice flour is really good to not help your bread stick. But you also don't need to dive into that if you're not ready for it. The last thing you'll want is some sort of bowl to hold your bread whenever it is rising. That could just be a kitchen bowl with a cloth inside of it. Or if you're ready to invest, you could get a banneton, a basket that's made for bread rising. But this is totally okay, and a lot of bakers just use setups like this. So now that we have our starter, our scale, our bread flour, our salt, and our water, and perhaps some rice flour, let's get baking. The most important thing is that your starter is active. And again, active means bubbly, airy, on the rise, has bubbles appearing, and it's growing. But maybe it's been a couple hours or it's been a good chunk of time before your starter's been fed and it's liquidy or it's not having many bubbles or the bubbles are really small, then you might want to feed it. So before we hop into actually getting started on the bake, I'm going to deal with the I think I waited too long and the starter isn't ready. And so that means I'm going to have to push off baking, maybe for another 8 hours, depends on your starter. So what I want to do is get a separate bowl that I'm going to let my starter live in, because again, this isn't really big enough, depending on how you like to bake. I like to keep it in a bigger bowl and covered. Some people use mason jars, looks really cute, but any type of bowl. I've got it on the scale and I've pushed the tar button, and so it's now zeroed out, it says 0. And then I'm going to pour my, again, starter that's not active, looking really runny, into this bowl. And I'm gonna see that I have about now 100 grams. There's some leftover. This could be given to someone. This is still totally okay. You could feed this, it would be active, or again, we could decide we don't want it anymore. So if this is my new starter, it's got 100 grams of starter in here, and I'm gonna feed it a 1-1-1 ratio. So 100 grams of starter means 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour. Let's say I only had 80 grams in there. I could still just do 80, 80, 80, 70, 70, 70, 50, 50, 50. Again, I could take whatever's in this and salvage it. 20, 20, 20. So again, if the starter was runny, looking like it needed to be fed, maybe had a layer of some sort of liquid on it, that's okay. As long as it's not pink or black, it's all right. We need to feed it. So 100 grams of starter, I'm going to feed it the 1-1-1 ratio to bulk it up, and if I wanted to use this, I would need to kind of watch it, and anywhere from 4 hours to 12 hours would be a good window of time when this is going to be active. So really quick, I'm just going to be using tap water. Some people's water has a lot of chlorine in it and some other things that could kill the starter, but I've had no issue with that. Some people leave their water out overnight to hopefully help that evaporate out. I, again, haven't seen any issue with it, so I'm just using tap water. This is kind of cold/room temp. You don't want it warm. However, the warmer your environment, within a narrow range, let's say 72-ish degrees, 75-ish degrees, your starter really likes warm-ish temperatures. So if you have a cold house, you might notice your starter is kind of sleepier. Okay, so again, right now the scale says 100 grams. I'm going to click the tar button, and now it says 0, and I'm going to pour my water in to where it says 100 again. I went a little over, it's not the end of the world. I'm going to move it off the scale to stir it really quick. Now it's looking real gross. I've got some soupy starter mixture. So it's the starter and the water right now. I'm going to bring the scale back. I'm going to zero it out. And I'm going to be giving it 100 grams of flour. So this is how to feed your starter. And again, it should be done about once a day. You can technically do it twice a day, and some people do. You can technically feed it once and then put it in the fridge and ignore it for a week. So some people do that. Maybe you're not ready to bake, but you want the starter maintained in your cabinet. Okay, so 100 grams. I should have been more prepared with the scoop. All right, so again, now I've added the 100 grams of flour to the 100 grams of starter that had the 100 grams of water added to it. Gonna give it a stir. And then again, this is me feeding it. It has now been fed. So your sourdough starter feeds on water and flour. It's gonna be a thick consistency. And then again, if you were to observe it, over the next 4 to 12 hours, you would see it rise and bubble, and then eventually fall and deflate. And that means it's hungry again, and it might start producing a liquid. And again, that's not the end of the world. You just wanna get it fed. So now we have this kind of thick paste, no bubbles. There's a couple clumps in there, and I'm gonna be covering this. You can get all sorts of coverings. You can just use a towel. I like to use just a little shower cup. And there it is. I can leave it on the counter for a whole day. I could watch it and maybe use it in about 4 to 12 hours, or into the fridge, not feeling like messing with it. Could ignore it for up to a week. Okay, so that's feeding your sourdough starter. The only other thing to know is, let's say I just fed it today, now it's tomorrow, and I'm still not wanting to bake with it. You always want to discard a little, and there's all sorts of discard recipes. So for instance, if you go back to what I had left over here, this would be discard. And so I would just rinse it down the drain with lots of water. Some people put it in the trash can to save their plumbing some issues. Or again, you can save your discard and use it for recipes. So that's just something to know, is if I wanted to feed this tomorrow, I have 300 grams here. I don't want to feed 300, 300, 300. That'd be a lot of starter to keep. So again, you will discard or pour some of it off until you get about whatever you're wanting, maybe 100 again, and then you'll feed it 100, 100. This 1-to-1 ratio. So perhaps complicated, but feel free to reach out if you have any more questions on feeding and maintaining your sourdough starter. Let's bake some bread. Okay, now back to our starter that's active. It has some bubbles on the surface. It's been 4 to 12 hours, depending on your temperature in your house. This one's actually been 12 hours, but it's bubbly, not forming any liquid. So what I'm gonna do is, again, grab my scale with a bowl. I've pushed the 0 button, so now it reads 0 grams, and I'm gonna want 400 grams of bread flour. A little messy there. If you've got extra, you can just spoon it off. All right, here we go. We've got 400 grams of bread flour in here. Now we want 230 grams of water. This is just a basic beginner recipe. You can up your hydration or add more water when you're feeling more confident. This just makes a pretty manageable dough. So 230 grams of water going in. Again, if you go over a little, it's not the end of the world. That's 231, that's okay. All right, and then I need about 160 grams of sourdough starter. If you are just now starting with this, some things to look for is it should float on the surface. It's okay if it doesn't though. It's also okay if you don't get exactly 160. If you're a little short, it just needs a little longer time to develop. So for instance, I have got about 141. That's okay. So 160 would have been nice. But if this is your first time baking and uh-oh, my starter's gone, I need you to know that this is okay. You can salvage your starter from this much. So in the perfect world, I wouldn't have put myself in a situation to run out of starter. But what you can do is kind of guess. Like maybe there's like 5 grams of starter just on the sides here. There's some in here. I'm just gonna put a little water and a little flour in here and mix it up and cover it. And it's gonna rejuvenate itself. So that's one method people use to not have a lot of discard. So I just put a little water in here. This part's not very scientific. This is not the best way, but this is a way. I'm gonna try and get it to that thick consistency. This is me getting off script. But now I was scared I ran out of starter, but in about 4 hours, I'll have made myself some, and then I can just beef it up. Maybe this is 30 grams of starter. I can give it 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water, and we'll be okay. Okay, so that was me saving what was left of my starter there. Let's get back to this. The only other thing we need now is salt. With salt, it's often advised to add it to its own separate bowl first. That way, if you overflow your salt, you're not adding a crazy amount of accidental salt to your recipe. So I went 5 grams of salt. There are also a lot of other ways to do sourdough, where you add your salt later. But in this beginner recipe, I'm gonna add it right now. So in it goes. Then I would recommend grabbing a spoon. You can eventually do something like this, a dough whisk, but you do not need this. And you're going to start stirring it up. If you own a mixer, you can do sourdough with an actual mixer. It's pretty fun to do by hand though. I'm eventually gonna actually use my hands. But at first, when it's this dry, sticky consistency, I'm gonna try and do everything I can with a spoon. It might be clumping to your spoon, so you can scoop it off. Dough whisks are really nice because they're pretty easy to get dough off of. Again, at this point in time, I might switch to my hand. So I'm trying to get it to come together. There's also value in wetting your hand. So if you don't want things to get too sticky, a wet hand can help that. There's also value in ignoring the dough for like 30 minutes. So if the dough's making you mad, you can always cover it and come back in 30 minutes to mess with it. And in fact, we're about to do something just like that. But right now it's shaggy, so it's always not very fun at this point. It's called a shaggy dough. It's not yet coming together. I'm gonna keep at it. I'm just rotating the bowl, trying to collect this dough from the side, maybe rotating the ball around. It's starting to get a little bit better, but still pretty shaggy. You can eventually add stuff to your bread. You can really add anything. If it's something that has a lot of moisture, that's the only thing to be aware of. For instance, if you want to use pickled jalapenos, you might pat them dry beforehand. Or if you're wanting to do a powder for coloring, like a spirulina powder, a butterfly pea powder, turmeric, it's often advised to mix that into your beginning water source so that it mixes better. And again, a lot of people use a way more hydrated dough, but for most people that can be a very frustrating dough at first. So for this recipe, it's not a very high hydration, which makes it a little bit more manageable. Okay, it's still not perfect. It's lumpy, got some clumps in it, but that's okay. So I'm gonna put it back in there. I'm gonna cover it up, and I'm gonna set a 30-minute timer. We're about to babysit this every 30 minutes, 4 times, so for 2 hours. And then we're gonna do something else for it in another 2 hours. So we need to be near our house for pretty much a 4-hour interval, just FYI. So I'm covering it, and I'm gonna see it in 30 minutes. Okay, so the first 30 minutes is up. I'm about to set another 30-minute, another 30-minute, and another 30-minute timer. So 4 rounds of this process. I'm not gonna record all of those, but you're gonna notice as you do these 4 stretch and folds, the dough become more elastic, stretchy, and pretty. So here is a stretch and fold, our first of 4. They're gonna happen every 30 minutes. Right now, again, the dough, not looking that cute, looking kind of straggly. A stretch and fold is just where you grab a corner, and again, you can wet your hand if you're nervous. A wet hand will allow it to not stick to you as much. Just grab a corner, pull, and plop it over. Stretch and fold it over. Rotate your bowl, grab a new spot, stretch, and fold it over. Grab, stretch, plop, and probably 4 times, maybe a 5th. You'll notice your dough is probably tearing at the beginning, not looking very stretchy. You can kind of shape it and get it down there. That was a stretch and fold. We did a round of stretch and folds, and now we're covering. Now we're gonna ignore it. And again, that was once. In 30 minutes, I'm gonna do it, and another 30, and another 30. So over 2 hours, I'm gonna repeat that process 4 times. And you're gonna notice the dough changing. So I'll see you on the other end of 4 stretch and folds. All right, so after you've done your 4 stretch and folds in 30-minute intervals, and again, if you mess it up a little, it's not the end of the world, then you leave it alone, covered for 2 hours-ish, and you're looking for kind of a doubling in size. If your house is colder, it might take longer. If your house is warmer, it might go faster. You are hoping that after about 2-ish hours, when you poke the dough firmly, it slowly kind of comes back. So in my house, it's been about 2 hours, and I'm going to take the dough out. And again, you can really push that bulk fermentation, that 2-hour chunk, longer if you want. Again, this is just you kind of learning. So if you can kind of see, my dough is stretchy. I don't want to do much right now. I'm just kind of letting you see what it's like right now. But now we're ready to shape it. So we're to the end of the really process. We're ready to shape it. There's a lot of ways to shape, a lot of different videos. There are oval shapes you can end up doing. We're gonna stick to a round and just use a bowl in case that's what you're using at home. So again, this is where if you have something called rice flour on hand, it can be really helpful. So I'm gonna use rice flour, and I'm going to be using this bowl and then just a cloth. And the cloth is going to get covered in some flour and put into this bowl. So before I mess with the dough, I'm gonna grab some rice flour, and I'm gonna sprinkle it on the towel to keep my dough from sticking to it. So I've got the rice flour, I've got just a handful of it, and I'm kind of sprinkling it in here. You can also do this on a flat surface with the towel and kind of just rub it in. Be very sad if your dough sticks to your cloth, which has happened to me before. Some people just use regular flour, but gluten loves gluten, so it will try and stick sometimes. So rice flour is a different type of flour, so that helps it from sticking to itself. Okay, so I have a very lined cloth. I'm putting it into this bowl, and now that part's done. So that leaves us with shaping. So I'm gonna do a roundish shape. What I'm gonna do, and again, there's so many ways and you can watch a lot of different videos, I'm gonna kind of stretch it out a bit. And then you're gonna see me take those corners in towards the middle. I am trying to make it a round shape to match my bowl, but again, you can do all sorts of other shaping videos. I'm trying to get a tight surface, so I'm kind of tucking it in and rolling, and tucking and rolling, and tucking and rolling. This is actually an old video. My camera stopped recording, so I had to find an old footage of me shaping a round bowl. I am slowly tugging it towards me using friction on the surface to try and make tension. So you want it to be very, very tight. You don't want it to rip. So if you notice your surface is ripping, then it's too tight, and that's fine. Just put it in the basket. So once it feels like it's holding its shape and it's pretty tight, you can put it in the basket for overnight. All right, so then you're going to want to preheat your oven to 450 degrees. You want it really hot. If you have something like this, it's a covered baking vessel to put your bread in, that is really nice to have. If not, again, there are other ways, and you can try baking it straight on the rack. You're going to want to put in a sheet pan with some water in it to create steam if you're going to be doing it straight on the rack. And make sure it gets really hot, so give it a good time to preheat at 450 degrees. Then having something like parchment paper or a silicone mat to put your bread onto so that you can lift and move it around is helpful. So this is parchment paper, not wax paper, and I'm going to be putting my bread out of the fridge overnight where it's been straight onto this. You can also plop your bread straight into the cooking vessel or onto the rack if you do not have any parchment paper, but parchment paper again just lets you lift and move the bread around. You're going to want some sort of device to score your bread or slice your bread to help it rise in a way that you prefer. There are all sorts of actual tools you can buy called bread lanes, Or again, I'm gonna run under the assumption that maybe you don't own one of those, and I'm gonna go with my sharpest knife, which I honestly don't know how sharp it is. So we'll see how this actually plays out. So I've got my loaf here. It's been covered and in the fridge overnight. You're gonna see again that maybe, hopefully it doesn't have a crust on it, so covering it hopefully helped that. So parchment paper will help me flip it out. And I turned it, and lift it out of here. And we have a little loaf. You can do all sorts of different scoring. You can do all sorts of designs, but again, I'm gonna try and keep mine pretty simple. And maybe let's do, ooh, choices. Let me think. I think I'm just gonna do a cross and a cross. I'm gonna try not to go too deep. I never cut with a knife, so this is a new experience for me. The reason you score is to help control the way the bread rises. So bread can rise in the oven, well, we want it to, and it can kind of get a mind of its own. So we're trying to control the way it rises in maybe a pretty way. All right, this is my first go around with the steak knife, so we'll see what happens. Okay, so now it's gonna go in the oven for 50 minutes, 50 minutes. If you're baking straight on the rack, you might wanna watch it. You might want to cover it with maybe with some aluminum foil so it doesn't get too dark. Some people like to take the lid off their baking vessel the last 10 to 20 minutes to allow for some color. So really I'm going to put it for 50 minutes, but maybe the last 10 I'm going to peek at mine and take the lid off to see how dark it is. And if I like it, I'll keep the lid on, and if I want it darker, I'll keep the lid off. Okay, again, putting in a sheet pan with water to allow for some steam could also help you during this time. Going into the oven for 50 minutes. And here we are. I have the bread out of the oven on a baking rack cooling. So that's important to let the bread cool. It's still kind of finishing baking. And so it's not recommended to cut into it while it's hot. So that can take 2, 3, 4 hours. But honestly, after an hour, you can cut into it and still enjoy that warmth, and it'll be good to go. So again, here is our finished loaf. If you are noticing the kind of sound it makes, it should sound hollow. If your bottom is too brown, next time you bake, you could put a sheet pan with water underneath to block some of that direct heat. If you don't like how dark your color got, you can keep the lid on the whole time. Give it a smell. Next time you bake, you can, again, keep testing the loaf. You can add more water to add more hydration to get a different crumb and a different kind of texture. You can add different things. You can push the bulk ferment time to really allow for some different fermentation and flavors. You can let it be in the fridge even longer. There are so many variables, but hopefully that was a good basic recipe and got you a wonderful loaf. If you made it, please reach out to me and send me what you made. It is so fun baking with you. I hope you enjoyed.